I get on a Western kick at least once a year, and what kind of Wild West phase would it be without a fistful of spaghetti Westerns?
4 cents. 4 cents is mighty little.
The price of 4 bullets. 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Of course, the undisputed master and founder of the genre would be Sergio Leone, whose name might as well be synonymous with the Italian Western, if not the Western, period. The Dollars trilogy and Once Upon a Time in the West are among my favorite films of all time, and their imagery, characters, operatic stylistic flourishes, rousing Morricone scores, and sizzling atmospheres have been iconic and influential since well before most of their fans were born. Another luminary of the genre who worked it at the same time, however, doesn't get the attention I feel he deserves. Perhaps it's because it's been all too easy to compare him to Leone, something that dogged Clint Eastwood's early directorial efforts in the genre as well. The two directors even have the same first name, which famously led Burt Reynolds to mistake him for Leone, dubbing him the wrong Sergio. Ultimately though, the Leone comparison isn't any fairer here than it is to Eastwood. They're all different voices, and there is greatness in each oeuvre that is too often forgotten or sold short in the endless rat race to definitively list and rank everything and everyone. This is particularly true of Sergio Corbucci, who is often reductively described as a spaghetti western director who added a lot more red sauce. Corbucci's films may be indebted to the Dollars pictures, as all spaghetti westerns ultimately are. However, they've also been sneakily influential in their own right, recently and most obviously to Quentin Tarantino. Corbucci often told melancholy stories with surprisingly dark and nihilistic endings. To an even greater degree than Leone, Corbucci had a cynical view of frontier life and the allure of the Wild West, as well as a great deal of empathy and pity for the types of people it broke down or destroyed. We see this partially through his constant subversion of the cowboy figure and Western archetypes. Django, the titular character in his most famous film, walks into town sloshing through the mud with a coffin in tow rather than riding in from the horizon at dawn. Navajo Joe's hero is a Native American, and most of that film's white characters are ineffectual and cowardly. The Hellbenders follows a ragtag group of Confederate monsters, and the moral center of the film is a saloon dealer that they've taken hostage. The Great Silence prominently features characters struggling in the snow, fighting for survival against the harsh winter and manipulating loopholes in the legal system for profit and personal gratification. In The Specialists, the trope of the evil outlaw terrorizing a noble community that must defend itself is turned on its head, with Johnny Halliday's character slowly dismantling a border town whose every institution has been poisoned with corruption and greed. Environments are as harsh and ugly as the self-interested people, and the gruesome consequences and aftermath of the genre's typical quick-draw violence is often lingered upon. Shootists are frequently rendered useless in this dog-eat-dog world by having their hands mutilated so they can't use guns. George Lucas wasn't the only one with a thing for hands. Additionally, Corbucci's westerns always prominently featured tough, intelligent, and determined female characters. I won't pretend he's politically airtight by 2023 standards, and his films can be quite crude in a devil-may-care fashion, though I'd argue part of that is just keeping the consequences and stakes of this vision of the West consistent for all of his characters, regardless of their gender. At the very least, the amount of agency and importance women have in the direction of each film's narrative is noteworthy for the time and the genre, and really that only scratches the surface of the ways he's often packed his work with incendiary left-wing provocations. Before we move on and get into the films themselves, one disclaimer. I'm omitting, maybe to the disdain of many, Corbucci's The Mercenary and Compañeros here. A few reasons for this. For one thing, while they absolutely have Western elements and iconography, I wouldn't call them straight Westerns in the same way that these 5 films are. They bring Corbucci's early career directing comedies full circle with his Western output and feature elements of the macaroni combat film. In my view, this tracks with Corbucci's sentiment that he often found his films turning into Westerns even when that wasn't the original intention. They're also films that are deeply in conversation with each other. I'm more interested in the themes and stylings of the Mud and Blood trilogy, which is generally accepted to be made up of Django, The Great Silence, and The Specialists. Though I'd argue the often overlooked Hellbenders and Navajo Joe should make it a 5-film movement. So let's take a look at how Corbucci subverted the Western, beginning in 1966 with
Django, have you always Django, have you never loved again? Love will live on, oh, life must go
When we first see Franco Nero's Django, accompanied by Luis Bacalov and Rocky Roberts' soulful, iconic theme song, we assume he's on a romantic quest to bury a loved one in the coffin he drags behind him. The film builds the mystery of what's housed in the coffin for a strong and atmospheric first act, as the saddest border town ever is introduced. The saloon is a desperate place where the musicians and prostitutes get drunk by themselves waiting for potential customers. The town is a barely standing neutral zone between an army of Mexican revolutionaries and a marauding pack of racists heavily modeled on the KKK. Django quickly antagonizes these men, much to the discomfort of the saloon. Then we find out what he's really got in the coffin. As with A Fistful of Dollars, it's a Yojimbo-style setup here, with an even stronger undercurrent of fatalism. Why the hell would anyone want to fight over such a horrible place? Nero plays a northern officer in the film and spends a great deal of time blasting Jackson's bigots, also a departure for a genre that has often glamorized Confederates as romantic underdogs. The hidden machine gun is quite instrumental to the plot and is continually used to surprise whoever crosses Django. Where the quick-draw duel of the Wild West was ostensibly about fairness, honor, and skill, this is a cheap, effective, OP way to kill pretty much everyone. Maria, a woman Django saves at the beginning of the film, is the often dismissed center of logic and justice in the film. She also totally saves his ass Grace Kelly style at one point.
Fa presto, Django, fa presto!
Double kill.
This is partially because Django himself is hardly a bastion of fairness and justice. He has his own scores to settle and wants to go it alone. He's also a far cry from any kind of omnipotent gunslinger. By the end of the film, he's weak, battered, barely standing, and we genuinely aren't sure if he'll survive or not, given the film's attitude towards life and death for even its most central characters. Now, there are lulls here and there, especially after the initial build-up and catharsis of that first act, but the film's payoff is ultimately very strong and consistent with Nero's character, the world, and the story. Perhaps more than any other film Corbucci made, Django's influence is far-reaching. Tarantino for one used the name, the theme song, included a Franco Nero cameo in Django Unchained, with gloved hands for consistency with what happens to his character in this film, and other music cues. The Reservoir Dogs ear scene also has its origin here, which was also later riffed on by John Woo in Hard Target. This scene is grossest here though, and probably one of the chief reasons it was banned in England at the time. The film's violence caused a huge uproar.
Sergio Leone, I remember, he made A Fistful of Dollars that was very successful. One day, Corbucci said to Leone, "I'm doing a Western with a new guy, you better come on the set and look at him." And he came on the set, and he looked at me and he said, "I think you're right. You have a good eye. This guy is gonna be successful."
And it spawned an imperial fuckton of sequels and imitators, such as A Few Dollars for Django, Django Shoots First, Django A Bullet for You, Django Does Not Forgive, Django The Last Killer, Django Kill, If You Live, Shoot! Don't Wait, Django, Shoot, Son of Django, Django Kills Softly, Django Prepare a Coffin, A Noose for Django, Django the Bastard, One Damn Day at Dawn, Django Meets Sartana, Django Defies Sartana, Django and Sartana Are Coming, It's the End, A Pistol for Django, Ballad of Django, Django Adios, Long Live Django, Sukiyaki Western Django, and Django Unchained. Speaking of Django Unchained, many ingredients that would later help form that film and Inglourious Basterds were present in Corbucci's next Western, 1966's Navajo Joe, which follows a young and determined native warrior on a quest for vengeance after his tribe is slaughtered by scalp hunters. The film features Burt Reynolds in one of his earliest roles, and yeah, moving past a wigged and bronzed Burt Reynolds as a Native American, supposed Cherokee ancestry or not, it was a common flex to make this claim at the time, and who the fuck was on Ancestry.com to confirm that shit, is far from easy in 2023. But again, in the context of its time, the film is still quite bold and provocative in its intentions. Not only is its main plot about a native hunting down and killing the white men who massacred his tribe, it also depicts the film's other white characters as generally ineffectual and cowardly. He is their only hope for salvation.
But you can't. An Indian sheriff?
The only ones elected in this country are Americans.
My father was born here in America. His father before him, and his father before him, and his father before him. Now, which of us is American?
The film depicts the oppressed rising up to take revenge on the oppressor, taking the traditional cowboy role from them. The Morricone score is rousing, emotive, and just customarily incredible, sampled to great effect by Tarantino at the end of Kill Bill Volume 2. When Corbucci is helming scrappy, frantic action scenes to it, and using the straight-ahead focus of the revenge tale, the film certainly has its moments. Again, however, it loses steam in a slack midsection. It's muddled with too many poorly acted side characters and odd subplots that distract from Joe's mission, as well as overdone comedic segments that feel tacked on and atonal. Perhaps some of the film's flaws can be attributed to the famously frustrating shoot and bad blood between director and star. Reynolds thought he was getting Leone, and Corbucci thought he was getting Marlon Brando. Both men hated each other, and Reynolds reflected poorly on the film for most of his career. Corbucci's follow-up to Navajo Joe remains possibly his most underrated and underseen film. 1967's The Hellbenders is also his most tightly plotted adventure. Shortly after the Civil War, a family of Confederate soldiers massacres a Union convoy who had been transporting decommissioned currency. They plan to use the money to rebuild the Confederacy and restart the war. Key to their plan is the appearance that they're on a personal mission to bury a general. They have a fake grieving widow in tow to sell this theory. When she is killed, however, they enlist a new one, a saloon dealer in a bind played with conviction by Norma Bengell, who jumps at the easy money, then realizes, to her horror, who she's fallen in with.
You're the convoy killers, aren't you? You robbed him and murdered the lot.
We're Confederate soldiers, honey. On a mission.
Be smart, daughter. Do as you're told and you won't be harmed.
You scum. It was all lies, every
The
word.
$2,000 I told you is true. Tell her, Paul. Figure's correct.
She drives much of the narrative and is one of Corbucci's best characters, cunningly playing both sides when her survival depends on it. She abhors the men and their goal, sowing seeds of mutiny and leaving clues for the Union soldiers on their tail. Unlike many westerns that take a romanticized lost cause look at the Confederacy, this film makes them out to be vicious assholes driven only by self-interest. And it's that inability to band together in any way that dooms their neo-Confederacy and really makes it look pathetic. The act of taking a Confederate jacket out of a coffin and putting it on, of storing money to rebuild the Confederacy in this same coffin, is significant beyond a clever plot device as in Django. It visually cements that this is a dead cause, a dead movement, and will remain so. The opening attack scene is also intense and infamous. It's unsettling because of Corbucci's greater attention to the dying Union soldiers than the attackers, who we see only briefly, usually grinning like maniacs. Especially at the top of the film, you're going, these are our main characters? This Ennio score is also one of my favorites. It's a propulsive adventure beat with an undercurrent of militarism, sadness, and futility, perfect for the lost cause the men pursue. There are many suspenseful, tightly wound scenes where the group faces Union inspections and must improvise to avoid bloodshed. And along with bandits, the elements, and the terrain, they continually encounter situations that directly confront them with the horror of what they've done or what they're doing. They meet grief-stricken relatives of the slain general whose name they've used, and witness the casual brutality of martial law which is enacted after their initial massacre. The whole story becomes about the consequences of the sort of Western violence that is so often inconsequential. If you missed my gushing impromptu tribute to this film, I'll state the obvious takeaway from it. I love 1968's The Great Silence, and it's an easy contender for one of my very favorite westerns. It's a film whose harsh beauty is perhaps best encapsulated in one of its earliest shots. We see our protagonist and his horse struggling and isolated in the sparse, snowy terrain, making little progress in the endless, eclipsing white. We linger on the Sisyphus-esque reality of surviving in this environment just long enough. And then... he's even further out than we thought. The film's plot is packed with moral murk and complicated circumstances. The mute bounty hunter Silence operates within legal boundaries by baiting his opponents into drawing first, before gunning them down with a speedy Mauser pistol. The Snow Hill community where most of the action takes place is so devastated by the blizzard that many former townsfolk have become wandering outlaws who must steal to survive. A corrupt judge named Pollicut, with whom Silence has a dark history, legally places bounties on the thieves, but it's not as much about justice as it is profiting off their stolen property. Klaus Kinski's Loco and his band of bounty hunters eagerly hunt the townsfolk by any means at their disposal. One of the thieves is killed by Loco after leaving the larger group to be with his wife Pauline, who vows revenge after his death. After rejecting the advances of Pollicut, who secretly desires her and her property, she enlists Silence to turn the tables on her enemies, and along the way, falls in love with him. In the middle of all this, there's also Frank Wolf's idealistic Sheriff Burnett, who's just started at this dangerous new post and is desperately trying to adhere all these hard-bitten, desperate people to a conventional rule of law, often failing to do so. The hell of winter in this time, making life a constant struggle for survival, is a central theme of the film. Nobody was plowing this shit, and it could get to be higher than a man. Ice and snow are also used by bounty hunters to preserve bodies, torture, and surprise attack people. The film laments the failure of the law to protect the innocent and the cyclical nature of revenge. According to Corbucci's wife, who often worked with him on set, the film was also partially inspired by the death of Malcolm X. Corbucci's headspace was dark at the time, and he was obsessed with the failure of progressives, and the way they're often persecuted for trying to do good. The entire drama is also propelled by one of Ennio Morricone's most haunting, mournful scores. Pauline is another of Corbucci's strong and empathetically drawn female protagonists. It was Vanetta McGee's very first screen role, and she would go on to feature prominently in US blaxploitation films through the 1970s. The film's passionate and tender interracial romance, which is shown in a lot more detail than, say, Star Trek's famous kiss from the same year, is also noteworthy. Once again, Quentin Tarantino also borrowed heavily from the film for The Hateful Eight and parts of Django Unchained, particularly the ways that survival in a harsh winter environment subverts the Western, and the setup of a new sheriff happening upon a stagecoach full of bounty hunters. The film's grim ending is perhaps one of the most well-known things about it. The hostage townfolk are mercilessly killed, and Silence and Pauline die in each other's arms. Loco survives and looks on the horror he's wrought with what could be a tinge of remorse. Of course, two studio-sanctioned happy endings exist, both of them landing with all the tonal consistency of Blade Runner's theatrical ending with that repurposed Shining footage. Though thankfully the producers came to their senses before the holiday release, and went with the one Corbucci originally shot. While downbeat like the rest of the film, especially given that you're endeared to these characters by the end and really want to see them win, it does land the film's revisionist themes with poetry, purpose, and sledgehammer impact.
Continuo a bere. Divento nervoso quando qualcuno smette di bere. E quando divento nervoso, io sparo.
The highly underrated conclusion to the Mud and Blood Quintet finds Corbucci in supreme command of his craft, and by this point quite confident in the genre. Some of his slickest and best choreographed action scenes are here, and he maintains a consistent, simmering undercurrent of suspense and intrigue, thanks in no small part to the luscious vistas photographed by Dario De Palma and Angelo Francesco Lavanino's eerie score. Also, Johnny Hallyday is incredibly badass in this film. The only evidence I feel obliged to provide for this is that he kills a man with a cash register, in self-defense. Yeah, it doesn't get a whole lot more badass than that. He plays Hud, a gunslinger who returns to the town of Blackstone after his brother Charlie's wrongful lynching. The townsfolk had confused him transferring a large sum of the bank's money at the manager's request with stealing it. Now Hud is targeting everyone complicit and everyone who profited from the killing, which really was the entire town's legal system and aristocracy. The people of Blackstone are, almost without exception, shown to be paranoid, money-grubbing elitists. Hud even saves their asses from bandits at the beginning of the film, and they hate him for it, mostly because he shows mercy to one of them. The only local we can muster some respect for is the cool-headed, intelligent villain, Virginia Pollicut, played by Françoise Fabian. She's one of the bank managers whose husband abandoned her after the lynching to pursue his own interests. This could very well be Mr. Pollicut from The Great Silence. Intriguingly, Corbucci admonishes both the greedy autocratic types and the aimless anarchistic youth this time around. The obvious and somewhat anachronistic gang of hippies are shown to be as disinterested and self-absorbed as Blackstone's elite, and when they get their first taste of power, they become truly monstrous. So what did Tarantino take this time around? Well, I spotted the origin of Broomhilda. Tarantino's character is likely a partial reference to this film, and the fiery ending of Inglourious Basterds seems to take some influence from the near-apocalyptic culmination of the town's collective greed. Gang leader El Diablo constantly giving a heavily embellished oral history to make himself look nails and his enemies look pitiful might be a subtle dig at the frontier history that was written and that has continued to be written in the Western genre. And in conclusive fashion, it makes a strong case for Corbucci's often controversial revisionism, crudeness, and brutality, even if this time around he allows the film's two noblest characters to escape, more or less intact.
It's unimportant, that's why I hate westerns.
After this, Mr. Corbucci, what films will you do?
A western, naturally.
Corbucci's contribution to the western genre was significant, and there's no better proof of this than the Mud and Blood Quintet. Even with their occasional stumbles, I wholeheartedly recommend every film I've covered here to Western fans. Corbucci passionately interrogated the Western myth and its genre conventions in ways that impress, shock, and entertain to this day. I'm sure Tarantino will be far from the last genre director to riff on him, decades after his own well-earned ride into the sunset, and I think that makes remembering and appreciating the source all the more important. Thank you for watching, everyone.